convinced that my mic's working. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. Perhaps it is. That's really good. Okay, so as you just heard, my research is with old lesbians. Ah, it works there and not there, doesn't it? Okay, where is it now? That's probably better. And I'm really delighted to have been invited to come and talk to this seminar today, because it's very clear to me that Ambition for Ageing have got an agenda around diversity of various kinds and hard to reach populations, so it's really great to be able to contribute to that. Okay, so first of all, what do I mean about old lesbians? Well, in my case, it's women who were born before 1950 and who now identify as lesbian. For some of them that's been always, for others it's been comparatively recent. And who now identify as lesbian or in some cases bisexual. Now, why do I do this? Why this particular group of people? The answer is that, arguably, older lesbians are among the most invisible members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender community. Now, this idea that older lesbians are culturally invisible is not a new one. Back in the 1980s, there was a feisty old American feminist called Barbara McDonald. She wrote a book called Look Me in the Eye, which you might have come across. And she argued that old women are already twice unseen because they are rendered unworthy of attention by the combined forces of patriarchy, which ignores women, and the worship of youth, which ignores the old. So old women are twice unseen. And when an old woman is also a lesbian, then institutionalised heterosexism brings about a third denial of her identity. And another American scholar called Monica Keogh was the first person to describe old lesbians as being triply invisible, which is a nice phrase, and it's one that's been borrowed a lot ever since. Another way of putting the same thing is to say that in our culture, the word lesbian is a sexualised identity. When you say lesbian to people, they normally think first what they do in bed. And the concept old person is culturally asexual. We still have trouble thinking about, well, our parents doing it, let alone our grandparents. And so that means that for a lot of us, the idea of an old lesbian is actually quite difficult to compute. So, let's test that one out. Let's say in your professional life that an old woman is introduced to you, this is Mrs. X. Okay? Now, for most people, I would argue, the word Mrs. will reinforce their unexamined assumption that Mrs. X is and always has been heterosexual. And once that assumption has been made, if no male partner is in evidence, then it will follow that Mrs. X must be either widowed or divorced, and hence alone. Now, in actual fact, out of the hundreds of women that I surveyed for this research project, just over half, 52%, had been married, but they all identify as lesbians. In the over 80s age group, I have to say, that goes up to 2/3, and I think it's easy to understand why. And although now all of them now identify as lesbians, and 4 out of 10 roughly are still in physical stroke sexual relationships with other women, many still use their married names. And to complicate the matter further, while over 1/3 of them say that they married because it was the expected thing and they hadn't any alternative, 1/4 of those say that they were in love with the man they married. So these ideas challenge our popular simple stereotypes, both of old women and of lesbians. Now, motherhood can be another cultural barrier to recognising an old lesbian. As one of my interviewees' mothers said when she came out to her, "But you can't be, dear, you're a married woman with children." End of. However, 4 out of 10, I know I see some giggles around the room, of recognition. 4 out of 10 of the women in my survey have had children, and in the over 80s age group, again, this rises to 2/3. Now, just an aside, what if the old lady who's introduced to you is Miss X rather than Mrs? I suggest that that wouldn't set any suggesting bells ringing either, because the lesbian identity of older women who have remained legally single, and that was about half of the people who participated in my research, can be obscured by a whole different set of cultural assumptions, because actually those stereotypes of the single woman are not very far below the surface. You know, the old maid, the sad spinster, the one who's never been kissed. So, she might have been kissed. And was it by a man or a woman? We don't often stop to think. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about then when I talk about older lesbian invisibility. And when I became a postgraduate student a few years ago, I became aware that this older lesbian invisibility also extends to academic research. In sexuality studies generally, lesbians feature far less often than gay men. Lots of reasons for that, which I could go into, but ask me if you like. And that underrepresentation has been replicated so far in LGBT ageing studies. I say LGBT because I haven't always got the energy for all the other letters, but you will take me as read, won't you? So because queer gerontology is really a very, very new and very small field, so far very little of it has focused on lesbians. Now, this imbalance leads to people making and publicising assumptions about older lesbians' lives that are actually, when you look into the data, based on the lives of gay men or of much younger lesbian and bisexual women. So I was interested to know whether the findings would be different if, in Monica Keogh's words, lesbians over 60 could be encouraged to speak for themselves. Now, researchers in gay studies and ageing and so on are well aware of this problem of the missing older lesbian, and they've usually accounted for it by pointing to the difficulty of finding any older lesbians to study. And they put this down to the unwillingness of these women to participate in research or be identified. So it's our fault, we're hiding, okay? Now, to some extent, I have to say this is true, because even in these days of legal protection and same-sex marriage and so forth, many older women who identify as lesbian, particularly those who came out at a young age, still go to great lengths to conceal their sexual identities. And I do find, the more the 21st century goes on, the more I find people who are surprised, who say to me, oh, but why would anybody be in the closet these days? Oh, nobody has to be, etc. And the answer, of course, as you will know, is that this hiding is the legacy of long lifetime of social stigma, of lives lived in the closet, and in many cases, of real suffering when they were younger. So as a result of that genuine need to hide our sexual identities in years gone by, some older lesbians are even now not out to their friends and neighbours, and a significant, though small proportion, are not out to their families either. Now, some of these scholars have pointed to the need to find new research strategies to access this particularly hard-to-reach population. And I have to tell you, my dears, that in my experience, the most effective new research strategy is to be an old lesbian yourself. This has given me a huge advantage because although my participants were enormously varied in terms of class, education, socioeconomic status, anything you like to think of, they were all prepared to welcome me into their lives, into their homes, because they saw me as a member of their own tribe. And that's still important. In fact, their experiences were very often different from mine, very different. But they believed that we had something important in common, and I think we do. And it enabled them to trust me with stories they might not have told to somebody else. So as a result, my research recruited around 400 lesbian women over the age of 60 across the UK. And somewhere on the publicity it said I talked to 400 women. I'm afraid I didn't manage that. It was a mixed methods project, so it consisted of a large-scale questionnaire survey. That's where the big numbers came in. And so I had quantitative data from that. And then I had qualitative data from a lot of life history interviews, and for the people who live too far away for me to reach to interview them, biographical or autobiographical writing. So I got 50 or 60 lives to put the flesh on the bones of the numbers. And the women, as I have said, were all born before 1950 and were between the ages of 60 and 90 when they took part in the research. Now, they came from all over the United Kingdom, and in most respects, including ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status and political affiliation, the sample was broadly representative of the British population as a whole. And through the lens of this considerable database, the invisible community of old lesbians comes into focus. Find an arrow. There they are, having a picnic. And offers, I suggest, a different perspective for us then on the ways in which ageing might intersect with both gender and sexuality. Now, my findings are reported in detail, if you were interested, in my book, and I think there's a flyer on the table. I'm much less embarrassed talking about my book these days, because about 3 weeks ago it went into paperback. You know that academic books are ferociously expensive, and nobody except libraries can afford to buy them, so I've sort of kept a bit quiet about it. But since it went into paperback, it really has become a bit affordable, and it's at the moment until the end of the year. If you're interested, do pick up the flyer, because there's a discount on it as well, so you get 20% off the paperback, and it actually comes into the realm of the affordable. And of course, it makes a jolly good Christmas present for any old lesbian you happen to know. So I've said that now, I won't say any more about it. Today, I've only got time to talk about a small sample of those findings. What I propose to do is to go on now until I've talked for about 20-25 minutes, and then stop so that you can have a break, maybe have a bit of discussion. Then I'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll have some questions at the end, if that seems okay. So that just gives me time to talk about a very small sample of my findings. And what I'd like to concentrate on then are two things that I argue combine to make lesbian old age different from other. And these two things are, first of all, the effects over the life course of living with a stigmatised identity and sexuality. Now, that's an experience, obviously, that old lesbians share with gay men of their generations. And gay men will tell you, of course, that our lives weren't anything like as bad because we were never illegal. But second, we'll go into that in a minute. And secondly, something which older women definitely don't share with older gay men, which is the generationally inflected experience of gender, which they share with other older women. And it's this combination of oppressions which I suggest makes lesbian old age different. Now, sex between women has never, as I said, been illegal in the UK, as male homosexuality was for many years. However, as I've taken to putting it, prosecution is not the only form of persecution. And my participants belong to generations for whom being a gay woman could mean, at the very least, social opprobrium, and at the worst, rejection by your family, the loss of your job, physical and sexual violence, and if you were a mother, the loss of custody of your children. These experiences, and the very fear of them, have been formative for many of the women in my study. While older generation lesbians have shared that stigma with gay men, they were, of course, also at the same time disadvantaged and oppressed just for being women. And in ways which I have to say it is sometimes easy to forget in the comparatively enlightened climate of the 21st century. Now, I'm old enough to remember when things were different, and I think one or two of you might be. So let me just remind you that the socio-legal and financial liberation of women in the West has happened very slowly, and much of it has happened during the adult lifetime of my generation. And just to give you something to think about, there are three things that we take for granted, okay? But actually haven't been there for very long. Equal Pay Act, when was that, dears?
75-ish.
Not bad, not bad. And the Equal Pay Amendment Act, which was actually the one that gave it teeth. Anybody? You know, because the original act said you shouldn't pay people differently for doing the same job. But it wasn't until we got the amendment that said job of equal value that it actually meant anything. When was that? Do you know? It was 1985. That's really not very long ago. And it took quite a long time to give that teeth as well. This is one that I remember, and one or two people have mentioned to me. So, what about women can apply for a loan or credit in their own name? Did you know, some of you younger people, that it wasn't possible when I was young for women to have a mortgage or so? No, and that wasn't changed until 1980. So, women's financial autonomy is a comparatively recent phenomenon. And just quickly, if we look at some other rights and equalities that we now take for granted. Sex Discrimination Act. That was 1975, that's what you were thinking of, wasn't it? It was a great, you know, it was a heady time, wasn't it, the 70s? And then, of course, the year after that, the Equal Opportunities Commission, which was the thing that was put in place to make the Act actually work. So that was 76. And I love this one. I just thought it speaks to a younger generation, help you to understand. At what point did the Court of Appeal decide that bars and pubs are no longer able to refuse to serve women at the bar? Anybody like to guess? Well, it was 1981. Yes, it's jaw-dropping, isn't it? So, women's social and financial autonomy is a comparatively recent phenomenon. So let's go back to the 1960s when most of my interviewees were young. And let's think about two young women. This picture was actually taken in 1967. This is Stevie and Anne, two young lesbians. Let's imagine them setting up home together in 1967. Doubly disadvantaged for being lesbians and for being women. Sorry if I wandered out of your camera shot, I'll stay here. Women's pay was lower than men's, or should I say is, but was certainly lower than men's because there was no act to forbid it. So a lesbian household's income was lower than that of their heterosexual peers or their gay brothers. So they couldn't afford high rents. And as women, as you've seen, they weren't eligible for a mortgage either. They weren't able to buy their furniture on hire purchase unless they could get a father or a brother to sign the agreement for them. This is only the late 1960s and 70s I'm talking about now. They had no financial security, obviously, if one partner died, and they had no redress against discrimination at work, either on grounds of sexual orientation or of their female gender, a situation which was particularly fearful for a household with no male breadwinner. And of course a lesbian was considered an unfit mother, so she could and often did lose custody of her children if her sexuality became known. And I suggest that it's hardly surprising then that these women have had a habit of hiding, which they now find hard to break. Also, not surprising, that these past experiences of discrimination have formed their present attitudes to life and are reflected not only in their present, but in their comments about their hopes and fears for the future, which was one of the things that I talked to people about. The life experience of many older women who identify as lesbians has made them independent-minded, secretive, and resistant to outside help. They tend to rely on supportive social networks of other old lesbians, and usually that means people of their own age. But as one of my interviewees noticed, that's all very well until those sources of support fail, when age, physical disability and isolation mean that they will have to rely on health and social care services. Now, ironically, these resistant old women, these older lesbians, will have greater needs statistically of those services for older people. because women live longer than men, and because they're financially less well off in late life, and because older lesbians are statistically much less likely to have children or other family to support them. For all these reasons, they're likely to make greater use of health and social care services than other old people, whether gay or straight. A scholar called Carol Archibald suggested that older lesbians will not only differ in these ways, but will differ from younger lesbian women as well as their heterosexual peers in the way that they approach health and care services. And my data support that, actually, that idea, and indicate that that difference will be characterised by a deep distrust of what they see as the heterosexist assumptions and attitudes of services for older people. My fears, says Sylvia, are being at the mercy of people who find me disgusting and dirty. So there's a real tension between older lesbians' disproportionate need for services and the fiercely independent mindset of most of the women I studied. Even the prospect of care workers visiting them at home can be a source of stress. This is Angela, who, as you see, she says, even now when I have visitors come or people that aren't gay, I have to put those things away. All the things in her home that declare her sexuality have to be hidden in drawers. And if she had to have regular visits by home carers, for instance, which is on the cards for her as it happens, then she'd either have to hide these things all the time, or she'd have to reveal her sexual orientation to strangers, which she has never done. So, while they remain in their own homes, most old lesbians are at least still able to enjoy the support that comes from socialising with other women of their own kind. But this community of identity, as we might call it, was very important to my participants. They greatly feared losing it if at a later stage of their lives they had to go into residential care. Now, this is a real horror. Nobody wants to think about going into residential care. I realise this, not straight people, not gay people, but it does hold these additional worries for LGBT people. So as you see from these quotes, they feared that being in a care home would mean having to live full time in an unsympathetic culture, basically, with the possibility of losing your identity, as well as facing discrimination and prejudice. And one of my interviewees was particularly outspoken about this. It's a wonderful old woman called Crunchy. Crunchy imagines a residential care home as a patronising heteronormative environment in which she would have to either hide her identity or be subject to discrimination. She says, I've had really nice relationships with women and I don't regret a life like that, but I won't be able to say that. And she also was convinced that the staff would be homophobic in such a place, and she talked about, they would have nasty talks about me in the staff room. They would think I'd be pinching their bottoms. I'm sure they would, she says. Now, sadly, research into care provision for older LGBT people does suggest that such fears are not without foundation, and that we can receive suboptimal care at end of life as well. And it's due to such factors as assumed heterosexuality, what I talked about earlier, lack of staff awareness and training about same-sex relationships, as well as homophobia among both staff and other residents. And these concerns were very clearly reflected in the answer to one of my survey questions. I asked people about different types of residential care, most of which I have to say were completely imaginary, because there is only one kind at the moment, which is the sort of mixed gender, heterosexual sort of place we're all used to. And that, I asked for positive, negative responses, and I got 83% negative response to the kind of residential care homes that we think we could possibly find ourselves in. When I asked them about if there was a care home for just LGBT people, then it completely reversed and I got a 60-something% positive response to that. But I got a lesbian-only home, 76% positive response. And interestingly, a woman-only environment scored almost as highly and higher than a mixed queer one. So I think that's quite interesting, because I think these responses are moving back to something that I said before, which is that our past inflects our present, but it also affects our ideas about the future. That for many old lesbians, because they're of that generation, feminist and separatist ideas still inform, however unconsciously, their idea of what an old age utopia might look like. And this, among other things, suggests that the needs of old lesbians in late life might be different, not only from those of straight people, but those of gay men as well. Now, there they are again. Let's look at them for a while. I'm going to stop there for a bit, because I think you've listened for long enough, and give you an opportunity just to do a bit of talking among yourselves. About 10 minutes, let's have as a break, and then I'll come back, tell you a couple of stories to finish off with. Would you like to, if you haven't already met the people on your table, have a chat with them, and think about, partly I'd like to generate some questions for later on, we have Q&A. So you might like to think about things like, what do you think of it so far? You know, what are your reactions up to this point? Do you know any old lesbians? If you do, how out are they? Do you work on the cultural assumptions that I was talking about earlier? Or have you worked through that and come out the other side? And have you got any questions that you'd like to pose in about another 20 minutes when we get to the Q&A? Okay, I'm going to stop now. You talk for a bit. I want to conclude the session with just a few more thoughts about how the things that I study and write about can be applied to the way in which we think about any older people, because that was kind of the promise in the title, wasn't it? And I do need to do something about that. So I've talked so far about the way in which the past shapes our present. And I think that's a really important thing for people that have lived with stigma, like people who are lesbian and gay. And I guess if you're trans, you're still living with it, so that's even more of a struggle. I also talked about the way in which the stigmatised past can manifest itself in present attitudes and behaviours. And I've talked about a little bit about the diversity of the LGBT community, and indeed of the older lesbian community. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, about the fact that not all LGBT people, and therefore LGBT older people, can be assumed to have either the same attitudes or the same needs. Lesbians have different histories from gay men, as I've said, and that means that they might have different needs in their older age. But then again, not all old lesbians are the same. They are, in fact, as diverse as any other cross-section of society. Rich and poor, educated or uneducated, able-bodied or not, and all the other kinds of differences that we have as human beings. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories very quickly, just to illustrate that diversity. And I'm going to talk to you about the two oldest of my interviewees. They're called Monica and Edith. And I think they illustrate that point about diversity quite well. Let's start with Monica. Now, Monica was born in 1922. She was the youngest child of an affluent middle-class Jewish family living in North London, and later in Sussex. Her parents expected her to be married in her early 20s, but she nonetheless, as a young woman, had a good deal of freedom for those times, working for the War Office during the war, living in a flat in London with a group of other young people of both sexes, joining a theatre troupe and travelling in Europe, so quite a bohemian lifestyle for the time. She had become aware of her attraction to other girls early in her teens, knew no one else who was like it, and says that it disturbed her and frightened her, and she tried to ignore it. But at 23, she fell desperately in love with a girl who happened at the time to be having an affair with her older brother. She revealed her feelings to the girl, who was absolutely amazed. But Monica said to me, she was lovely about it. She said, "Oh, darling, I do love you, but not like that." And Monica, therefore, was desperate. She'd been rejected. She'd made this brave effort to tell this girl she'd been rejected, and she was absolutely certain that she was doomed to that sort of rejection for the rest of her life. So shortly after that, she married. She said, "Well, I imagined myself in love with him." And 4 years after marrying, she met her first real woman lover. Well, you're not surprised to hear that Monica's marriage soon ended, and that she had several lesbian relationships during her long life, including one with a quite well-known actress, but I'm not going to tell you who. No, because Monica's not her real name, and she did ask me not to use it. Okay. She also had a lively lesbian social life. She threw legendary parties. Although she remained firmly in the closet as far as everybody else was concerned, all the time. She was approaching 90 when I met her, and increasingly isolated, as we've talked about already, but she was still extremely secretive about her lesbian past. And in fact, we had to go into her bedroom and lock the door before she would speak into my recorder, just in case anybody heard, dear. So that's Monica. Now, if we think about Edith, Edith was born in 1919, so only a couple of years older than Monica, but her life is really a striking contrast. She was born into a struggling working class family in the Midlands. Her father was a butcher, but he was also a bit of a gambler, and as she put it, he liked to drink. So they were really hard up, and there was no girls' boarding school on the South Sussex coast for her. She went to the local council elementary school. She left at 14. She was a determined young woman, and I think probably had she lived in a later time, she would have gone far, because she's obviously pretty bright as well. With the support of an auntie, she learned shorthand and typing and found a job in an office, which was more than was expected for her. And there she met her future husband. And what she said to me was, when he said, "Marry me," I said, "Oh, all right then." Because that was what you did then. That was what all the girls did. Get married. We didn't know about anything else. So when she was 20-something and the mother of 2 children, she was completely amazed when she suddenly fell in love with another young mother at her son's infant school. In the end, she revealed her feelings to this woman, who was absolutely shocked and scandalised. And Edith says to me, she didn't want to know me anymore after that. She didn't want to know me. And I thought, well, I won't do that again. And she told no one, and she lived a normal family life for many, many years. She was middle-aged when she fell in love again, and this time, in some ways, it was worse because the woman reciprocated her feelings. And Edith told me, she asked me to go and live with her, to leave my husband and to go and live there. But of course I couldn't. I said, I can't. Our husband and 2 young children. So that was that. And I never saw her anymore. The woman found another partner fairly soon after, and Edith was absolutely heartbroken. But again, there was no one she could tell. And for the remainder of her 60-year marriage, she never spoke to a soul about her feelings for other women. By the time her husband died, she was 85 and blind. But shortly afterwards, she came out. She disclosed to the warden of her sheltered housing complex that she thought she'd always been a lesbian. And this blessed woman helped her to meet other local lesbians and to be supported by them as she took the terrifying step of coming out, first of all to her daughter, then to her son, then to all the rest of her extended family, right down to the grandchildren. Actually, of course, as we were saying earlier, the grandchildren were the least problem. They're just like, oh, that's cool, Gran. But coming out to her daughter was a seriously big deal. And for a few years, she had a small group of lesbian friends and occasionally attended lesbian events in her area. Now, I've told these 2 stories at some length, because they illustrate how many influences other than chronological age and sexual orientation can determine the course of a life. Born between the wars, both of them were children during the Depression, teenagers when the Second World War began, both married young, as did almost all my participants in that age group. Both were rejected by the first woman they fell in love with, but that really is where the similarity ends, isn't it? Because Edith had the burden of internalised shame, dread of family disapproval, together with her very strong sense of duty to her husband and children, and her lack of financial independence, I have to say, is a really important part of this story. Not only kept her in her marriage, but ensured that she never felt able to reveal or act on her same-sex desires while her husband was alive. Monica, on the other hand, who was middle class, child-free and comparatively affluent, had more choices. She was living in London, she was financially independent, she was moving in the more liberal world of the theatre, and she was able over time to develop a lesbian identity and to find a lesbian and gay social circle. So although she always kept her sexual orientation hidden from family and friends, she moved in a lesbian and gay subculture which affirmed her identity. And ironically, it was terrified, silent Edith who finally felt able to come out. I've thought about that quite a lot, and I've thought that it's about our need to be seen for who we are. Because, of course, Monica had that affirmation. Although she lived in a secret world, it had been a world which affirmed her in that identity. Nobody had seen Edith. And if we don't see people, we treat them as if they don't exist. And that builds up in her, so that after her husband died, she just felt, before I die, I've got to tell somebody. And what was lovely, of course, was that by the time she came out, which was in 2005, the world was a much less hostile place than she could ever have imagined. And she, interestingly, became more open about her sexual identity than Monica had ever felt able to be. And in 2015, when I was asked if I would talk about these women on Woman's Out, BBC Radio 4, and I had to ask some of the women, can I play bits of your interviews on this programme? And Edith said yes. She agreed to part of her interview being included in the programme, and she was at that time 95. Now, sadly, I have to say, there's a little postscript to this. Sadly, like a lot of other old gay people, Edith went back into the closet because the lovely warden left, the new one wasn't so friendly, the other residents were fairly homophobic and not really interested. And more recently, she's now 98, I think she was last week, she's developed mild dementia and she's in fact in residential care, but she is still occasionally visited by one gay friend, and I think that's probably still important. The gay friend is herself in her late 80s. But Monica stayed in the closet until she died, and there was no mention at her funeral of that whole important part of her life. I don't know about you, but I think that's really sad. So, if I have a case to make today, it is for looking beyond categories. I think that's what I'm really getting towards. To individual stories and individual needs. It's so easy to lump people together into groups as soon as we know one thing about them, isn't it? So if you've got a group, then you can identify their collective needs and stereotype them nice and quickly, and then we're all comfortable. So I want to argue that we have to factor in diversity, and that factoring in diversity means taking account of people's past as well as their present, if we're to understand them and meet their needs into their future. Now, I'm going to mention a book that isn't mine, this lovely, lovely book. Richard Ward and a bunch of his colleagues produced this lovely book, which is aimed at practitioners, that's why I mention it. And you see it's called Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual and Transgender Aiding, Biographical Approaches for Inclusive Care and Support. And what they argue is for exactly what I'm saying, what they call a narrative approach to LGBT ageing. To understand older LGBT people, they argue, we need to take account of their histories as well as their present. So really that's just another way of coming at what I hope I'm also saying. But of course, this lesson applies to old people generally, as well as to those of alternative sexualities, so I am coming around to what I said in the end. This was a lesson that I personally learned in a quite dramatic way, so if you'll forgive me, I will end with a little personal story of my own rather than all the stories I tell about other people all the time. I was in my early 40s when I was knocked down by a speeding car and put in hospital. Ambulance, clanging, the whole business. And it was in a quiet seaside town in the southwest of England. So I shouldn't have been surprised that when I woke up the next morning I discovered that I was the only woman on that ward under 90. Now that is literally true. There was a 6-bed ward and all the other 5 women were in their 90s. Well, it was a seaside town in Dorset, you know. The average age there is quite high. Now, why I'm telling you this story is that I looked around that ward and they all looked alike. There they were, wispy white hair, wrinkled faces, transparently thin skin, hospital nightgowns. Just an indistinguishable bunch of old people. Now, I was there a week, and by the time I left, I realised that in fact the ward was bursting with characters and bursting with stories. Opposite me there was a quiet, docile woman who said very little, but called out in her sleep every night for her presumably long dead mother to come and rescue her. "Take me away from here, Mum, take me away from this place," she cried all night. I don't know what the story behind that was or how long it went back. And her neighbour, who had come in from a local authority care home to have her bed sores treated, spent her nights begging her son not to do something that he was clearly about to do. I never found out what it was, but I can still hear her voice now. "Don't do it, Keith. Don't do it. Keith, come back. Don't do it." And it went on and on and on. Never found out what he was going to do, but the thought of it distressed his mother greatly. Meanwhile, Miss Brown, who was up that end of the ward, was a very well-spoken lady, complained all the time to nurses, and turned out to be the sister of a bishop to whom she had been unpaid housekeeper for most of her life. And opposite her, my favourite, was a lady called Viola. Her dementia regularly caused her to throw off any clothes that were put on her, and she spent quite a lot of her time naked. But even at 92, her body was very beautiful and fit, and her daughter told me that she had been a junior Wimbledon champion. So you see, I remember them all 30 odd years later. Vivid characters from that chapter of my story, and such a lesson to me as a younger woman about the way in which we see or don't see the old. So I think I can draw to a conclusion at that point by saying that none of us, straight or gay or anything else, want to be a stereotype. We don't want to be an anonymous cipher, we don't want to be a number on a list. None of us are just an old person. We're all the things that our long lives have made us. We are all individuals, and we all, not just the lesbians, want to be recognised for who we are. We want to be seen for the people that our lives have made us. I have to say, it's a huge challenge to those who will be looking after us, but it's one that I believe must be addressed if we're to create a society which is truly inclusive for everyone, whatever their differences, right into old age. So thank you, that's where I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much for that. It's really interesting. Definitely by the book. In terms of the women though that you spoke with, how did you find them?
How do I find them? I think there were several things that put me in a better position than previous researchers. One of them I've already mentioned was simply that I've been a lesbian all my life. I'm fairly well networked in all sorts of parts of the community. And the other thing that we were talking about on this table earlier on is that people in minority communities tend to be very well networked themselves. So I put out this call. And the second thing that I think helped me was the fact that the internet was then up and running, and this is sort of getting on for 10 years ago, and previous researchers hadn't had that. So I put out a call for participation probably to about 200 email addresses, which ranged from friends through gay press to organisations for old people, you know, everything I could think of. But it was probably only a couple of hundred. And within days, I was getting answers back from people I hadn't emailed, not only in this country but abroad. And I put that down to the power of internet and the power of lesbian networking. And the other thing I would say is that I've spent ages setting up a paper hard copy of my questionnaire, and I did work very, very hard at the confidentiality aspect. I made it very clear that no names were ever on these questionnaires, and I had an anonymous separate mobile phone with a reassuring message on that people could get in touch and ask me to post them a questionnaire and so on. What I wasn't expecting was that 90% of the questionnaires came back on the internet, which says something about the old people's use of technology, which is quite interesting as well. So there was that, and I said to my supervisor, because I was doing this as a PhD project, and I said to my supervisor, there was a woman in America 30 years ago who did a survey of old lesbians, and I want to do the same. And she managed to get 100 people all over the United States. Do you think it would be over-ambitious of me to aim for 100? And my supervisor, who's a bit gung-ho, you know, she's butch lesbian, and she's like, oh, 100, 200 is your target. I'm like, thank you. And lo and behold, within 6 months, there were 400. So it was amazing. And what I found was I also got a lot of messages back. Although I told people, don't tell me who you are, I got a lot of emails and messages saying, we want to do... I think what it was, for people who've never been heard, they were reassured that they wouldn't be identified necessarily, but that they would still be heard, that our stories would get out there even if they didn't be outed individually. And I think people really wanted that. And being bossy old women that they are, they wanted to get involved as well. They wrote back and said, like, question 83 is rubbish, you know, or why haven't you asked about X, Y and Z? So there was a lot of participation. But that's the story of how it happened. And then quite separately, so as not to connect names and questionnaires, I asked for people who would like to give me their life stories. And I'm still doing that because it's completely addictive. And I can't give it up, so I still have my little recorder and I whip it out when I meet an old lesbian. So yeah.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it's the issue of reaching the marginalised within the marginalised centre of society, isn't it? And not always actually talking to the unconverted, the non-usual suspect.
I think we'll know we're there when someone who's completely straight and probably a young man can do the work that I've done. When people feel safe enough to talk to somebody who they don't think is part of their community. But that's a whole different world.
Thank you.
I heard, as I was going around, I heard some very interesting stuff about things that people are actually doing. Would anybody like to tell us a bit about that? Because there are some fantastic projects going forward.
Hi Jane, I'm Vi. I work at the LGBT Foundation, previously LGF, and I'm the Women's Program Inclusion Officer, so I work in the Women's Program to make it more inclusive for BAME women, older women and trans women. And one thing we are trying to solve is how do we make our events and our services more accessible and more interesting for older lesbian bi women, because we have a group of older LGBT women, and what they told me the first time I came was, well, yeah, it's accessible, just they're not interested. But we want them to be interested, and we want people who don't know about us to be able to come. All these women in the closet, they might need us. So how do you reach them?
That's a really good question, and can I say, the Lesbian Gay Foundation were one of the very, very first of those return emails that I was talking about that got back to me all those years ago. I think you've got to keep on trying. I'm involved with a group in Brighton, which is quite similar. It's a group for LGBT people over 60, and it's been going 3 or 4 years now. And at the beginning, it looked like just another place for people who already knew each other to meet. Rather similar to what you're saying. It was like, yeah, well, we'll come along because it's, you know. The purpose of it, though, was to reach the marginalised, the isolated. And I think just by being there and by advertising ourselves and by keeping on reaching out, we are beginning now, although there's still a core of those people who don't really think they need it. But as the years have gone on, 2 of the men in the group have died, and their partners have received enormous support from the group, and we're beginning to understand when you might need that. And also because we publicise phone numbers and helplines and things, we're beginning to get people who have got trouble, let's say with the council, with their rent, whatever, turning to the group for help. So I think it's just about keeping going. And I think as well it's about the people in that group understanding what the need might be in the future. That's the thing we don't want to think about, isn't it? We think, oh, we're all right, we've got our group, as you say, it's not interesting. But it is interesting when you come to the point where that group's not there for you. Maybe that's why people don't want to think about it, but it is important.
Thank you. And just for people who might be interested, on the tables there is flyers, because next Tuesday I will do the first community event. So I try to work with this group of older lesbian, bi women, well, LGBT women at LGBT Foundation to create it, to make sure it's fit for what you would like to do. So it will be a Christmas card workshop between 3:30 and 5:30, and then at 5:30 it will be a Christmas party where there will be karaoke, cabaret, lots of food and games and stuff like that. So it will be quiet, but at the same time fun. So it should work. And also if you have access needs and you would like to book a taxi to access our building or need help to walk from the station, you can get in touch with us and we can help you with that as well. So we try to make it as accessible as possible, but if you think of anything else I forgot, please tell me, because my aim is really to reach out to people and be there to support. So, thanks.
It's great. Fantastic.
I think one of the things that we were talking about on our table, I'm Sharon Summers, I'm the Development Officer for Ambition for Ageing, and I think just linking into what Jane was saying in terms of really interesting research in her talk today, was that we're looking at the scale programmes for Ambition for Ageing, and one of the things that we're looking at is carers into employment. And I did a scoping paper a while ago looking at, you know, who our target group might be, and it became evident that within the LGBT community, a lot of, because our programme's for people aged 50 and above, a lot of older people from the LGBT community struggle because they'll often won't put themselves forwards to having additional support that they might need, and some of that was around perceptions of organisations and how they might be treated if they try to access help in terms of their caring role or in terms of helping to get back into employment. So I think, you know, there's a dual thing. I think there's sometimes about homophobia, genuine homophobia from those organisations, but there's also the perception of older people from the LGBT community who actually are worried about accessing the support that they need because of that kind of history and their experience and actually being in the closet. So I think in our programme we're looking at trying to combat isolation and actually trying to look at how we can remove barriers, and I think we have to kind of try and be as imaginative as possible when we are working with specific communities who might have experienced a lot of stigmatisation over the years, to actually kind of say that it's not good enough just to have services there for people, because some people mightn't actually come forward because of their own fears and anxieties of having to come out, how they're going to be perceived and how they're going to be treated. So I think we need to kind of make sure that we build in further steps to remove those barriers. Otherwise, you know, it's not good enough to say, well, the services are there, you just have to ask for them. We should have to kind of have a sense of understanding of where people are coming from.
Oh, I think that is so true. I couldn't agree more with what you say. That the barriers are within the minority community, at least as much, and it's true of other minority communities as well, obviously, who've had a history of discrimination and expect it still, even when it isn't there. One of the sobering findings from my research was that 50% of the women who answered my questionnaire were not out to their GPs, which says exactly what you're saying.
Any other comments?
That actually leads to something we were discussing on our table, which was that the health service is often at the point of access, and we were going to ask you about how much you had looked at GPs and that whole, because that's the way into a lot of
I
other
haven't,
services.
but I can give you a link, not now out of my head, but if we could be in touch, I could give you a link to a quite large piece of research that was done about that. It was done in London, but I think it's fairly applicable. It's got some clever title, but it was about the relationship between LGBT people and their doctor surgeries. So yes, my feeling with women is that there is quite a difference between women who have had what you might call a heterosexual part to their life, especially those who have been married and had children. Because I think if you're married and you've got children, you go to the doctors for all sorts of reasons, and you have a different attitude to women who perhaps identified as queer when they were very young, particularly those that were gender non-conforming, and who have got a history of simply not wanting to come to the doctor and not presenting. And I think that's an area for concern. But I think it depends again on one's history. But do let's exchange contacts, and I'll send you that reference. Yeah.
Okay, so if we don't have any further questions, we'll wrap up. We have a round of applause for James. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.